I found out that you and I have somewhat similar takes on World War II, which we can get to.
Really? Oh,
Yeah, yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Always happy to talk about World War II. It's
We could
such
do
a
that.
fascinating period. The World War II book I always recommend to like total normies is Nicholson Baker's Human Smoke. I
Yes.
think that's a
Wow. That's amazing. That's the greatest book ever written. I love that book. That's
it's
incredible.
a very good book.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I go quite that far, but it's a very good book, and it's very accessible. And I think it sort of tells kind of it gives kind of the right tragic vision of those very tragic events, basically.
I
And
I just spent close to 2 years writing about 4 chapters in my upcoming book on World War II, and Nicholson
ooh,
Baker's Human Smoke was the inspiration for it. And used it for some research too. It's an amazing book. All it does is sort of summarize the daily news up until Pearl Harbor. And it really lays, just by doing that, it lays the case pretty convincingly, I think.
it's
That,
using this fascinating kind of pointillistic, tactic where it basically turns history into a bunch of essentially tweets that
Mhm.
are sort of strung together as a book. And these tweets are, of course, from the narrative of the time and not the present narrative. And the narrative of the time is somewhat different, not hugely different from the narrative of the present. You know what a great book is, great movie, sorry, is there's a movie directed by Don Siegel, who did Dirty Harry. And this has a script. It's not credited this way, but it was edited down from a longer film by Frank Capra called Your Job in Germany. That's a feature-length film. This is only 17 minutes. It's well worth your time. It's available on YouTube. It's directed, it was done in 1945 after the war by, again, Don Siegel, with a script by Dr. Seuss. It has a great title, which is, are you ready for this? Hitler Lives. And it's hard to describe. It's sort of a pure taste of 1945 era propaganda. The general theme of if you thought, I think a lot of people out there have sort of thought, with it, thinking about it, that sort of World War II was an American crusade to save the Jews. What you'll find from this movie is that it was actually a race war in self-defense against the Germans. And it's really a race war. I mean, you're like, wow, did he just say that? There's a lot of, did he just say that? And it's sort of this beautiful taste of the period. And what you realize when you're watching Hitler Lives is, you suddenly understand all of this just like sort of completely deranged Nazi and Russian and Soviet propaganda that you've seen, which is just clearly sort of unbalanced in this deeply disturbing way. And then what's even more deeply disturbing is to see this is like newsreel material. This is the pro feed that people were getting. And it's just completely out of touch with reality in this insanely crazed, bloodthirsty way. And then it comes back and it describes like, populism in the United States is apparently the same thing as Nazism. And then at the end, there's a beautiful picture of Stalin, and some talk about world peace. And so it's this really great 17 minutes of just like complete boomer mindfuck, period piece where, if you sort of come into this with this kind of cardboard, beautiful Hollywood received vision of World War II, you'll be just like, what the fuck did I just see? Right.
No kidding.
And no kidding. I strongly recommend that.
What's it called again? What's the movie?
It's called Hitler Lives.
Hitler. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Great little flick.
Okay.
And you can really taste the Dr. Seuss in it. Anyway, I think we got a little distracted.
Okay,
where were we?
Back up a second. So Nicholson Baker's Human Smoke, there's an implicit argument in it that human intervention in World War II was bad for the Jews. In fact, it basically guaranteed the fulfillment of the Holocaust. And that's the
Well,
argument.
nobody was even trying. I mean, that was never a goal of like saving the Jews. Was never like
Never.
I mean, you will not actually hear in Hitler Lives the word Jew is not used once.
Yeah.
Okay, you will see images of the Holocaust, but Hitler is presented as an equal opportunity baby killer. He wants to basically kill babies and invade New Jersey, right? And that is basically the goal, and that is a racial goal. That is a goal that the German, people have shared since the 1870s, right? And so you're basically confronted with this incredible balderdash, and you're like, oh, that was what was actually in people's minds when they were fighting the war. They were actually thinking, and if you go back to 1940 with the fall of France, you'll see in like period newspaper reports, you'll see people like, I think there's this one incident where George Marshall, okay, revered general, you're familiar with George Marshall. George Marshall is basically like, France has fallen and America could be next because France controls Dakar, and Dakar is only a couple of thousand miles from Brazil, and the Panzer divisions will be on the Rio Grande. And they actually believe this, right? And so the thing is, you have this thing that's fought under this ridiculous pretext, and then people realize that due to what sort of, here's this piece of reality, the Holocaust, which is ignored during the war, which is actually covered up during the war, as I'm sure you well know.
Yes.
And it just doesn't fit the narrative at all, because it's like, first of all, this is an atrocity story. We tried that in the last war, got totally burned, like not going to go down. Secondly, what we're basically saying here is that we're fighting a war for the Jews. Well, who else says we're fighting a war for the Jews? Okay, that's too subtle, right? So the thing is, it has to be covered up. It just doesn't work, right? So far as like a stereotypical neo-Nazi would assert, is this a piece of World War II propaganda that got out of hand? It's not even World War II propaganda at all, right? And instead, it's the equal opportunity baby killer and taking over the world theory. And then, in the 60s, people discover, hey, wow, first of all, this really was about the Jews. This really was mainly a Jew thing. Of course, did not match the Soviet party line either. And, they give it this great, epic, resonant name, the Holocaust, and all they have to do is tell the truth. It's amazing propaganda. The only thing they can't tell the truth about is, this is why the war happened, and this is why we hated Hitler in 1935, before any of this stuff had happened at all. And you'll find these people hated Hitler in exactly the same way in 1935, before, the Holocaust had happened. Okay, had there been some human rights abuses? Sure, but these same people are reading Walter Duranty stories from the Soviet Union, right? They're going crazy for the Soviet Union, which is in its period of greatest violation of human rights. So that can't be the cause. It can't be a human rights motivated thing. So why do these people, hate Hitler? And, there it goes into all these very interesting questions. Of course, you have a very obvious Nazi answer to that question, which is the Elders of Zion or whatever. I don't happen to subscribe to that belief. I suppose you could always surprise me with some evidence, but that goes into very interesting sort of geopolitical questions about what's going on at that time. Have you ever read Frederick Sanborn's Design for War?
Nope.
It's a very rare. It's similar. You must have read Tansel's Charles Collin Tansel and Beard's President Roosevelt and the Coming of the War, those classic works. So Sanborn, I have no idea who this person is, published by Devon Adair, which is a good house. It's a book that's in a class with Tansel and Beard, which is no small feat. Understanding that period is, obviously it's a really difficult and interesting problem. And I think, honestly, there's a lot that we'll never know. I don't think we can rely on files to be complete or things not to have happened orally. That happened on all sides of the war at all times. So it's a really, I'm glad you're attacking this problem, but you should, consider the amount of seriousness that it requires.
Yes. Well, I will say this: it's much less risky now to make this argument, because right now it's, I wouldn't say it's a consensus, but I think it might be a majority opinion among European historians that U.S. intervention, as I said, sort of guaranteed the Holocaust happening, because Hitler was saying, look, first of all, Nazi policy vis-a-vis the Jews was never to kill them until 1941, until late 1941. It was to move them out, to migrate them first to Palestine.
We'll never know what was actually going on in Hitler's head, but yeah, that was certainly official Nazi policy. Now, the Holocaust was always a military secret, right? And so we don't even find it really explicitly discussed in Hitler's table talk. We find allusions to it,
right,
plenty, but we don't find, and that's that's totally consistent with how that regime operated. And so, we don't know what, I mean, you've read Daniel Jonah Goldhagen. We don't know what Hitler had in his mind, but it certainly would have been, much more difficult. And, Hitler, of course, feels that this is a race war. He feels that he's holding a large part of the Jews hostage.
Mm-hmm.
And he feels that, sort of a hostage thing is basically pretty consistent with how this war is being carried out, right? Which is not with a whole kind of great amount of like love and respect for human rights and shit, right? And so he's basically like, look, I'm doing this. Meanwhile, of course, Hitler has this sort of very strong intuitive understanding of the world that he knows, but the world that he knows, he's never been to Paris before he conquers it, and he doesn't know shit about the United States. And so, he sort of fathoms somehow, he believes that, like, he knows that it's a fact that there are a lot of rich, influential Jews in New York. And in fact, if you read the dispatches of Count Potocki, the Polish ambassador to DC, whose documents the Germans captured in Warsaw and published. I don't know if you know about this, the Green Book, I think it's called. They were denied at the time, but they were in fact quite authentic. Potocki is writing back to Warsaw from DC saying basically the Jews are in control of everything, right? Of course, Poland is more anti-Semitic than Germany, right? And so naturally the man is an anti-Semite. He's going to see Jews under the bed. I'm not saying this is very good evidence that Jews are in fact under the bed. What is certain is that there are a lot of very influential, so, highly assimilated German Jews in New York, who have done very well for themselves and been very successful. And they include people like Sulzberger and his friends and yada, yada. Now, I would say that these people conform to Protestant, ways, which made them much more Protestant than any Protestant. But the important, fact of the matter is something that Hitler didn't understand, is that these German-speaking Jews had this like real loathing of Yiddish-speaking Jews, like frankly my ancestors, right? So, so there was this like, they wouldn't even say Yiddish; they didn't consider it a language; they would say jargon, right? So here are these like, a whole part of like early kind of highbrow, Upper East Side progressivism is basically, let's take these like, louse-ridden relatives of ours and like civilize them, right? And it's a huge thing in basically the early 20th century. And there's a lot of embarrassment there because, these people have tried, it's like the difference between like the Jack and Jill Club and like the streets of Detroit. Like, it's like seriously embarrassing, right? So, the thing is basically Hitler is saying, I'm going to like take, round up these millions of people in these shtetls, who are like seriously embarrassing and disgusting to you. And I'm going to kill them as a way to manipulate their behavior. Hitler is constantly thinking that he can basically manipulate the, behavior of his enemies by mass violence. That's why he puts all this energy into the V2. He's basically like, we're going to bomb London to make London less, aggressive. And of course, this doesn't work at all. It doesn't work for the Allies either. Like, the effect of bombing on morale is absolutely terrible. There is no, desire to leave Hitler alone because of the Holocaust. Like, the whole thing is just has this, it's this immense tragedy, but it has these sort of bizarre comedic elements to it that I think you, in a way, have to include if you're writing the history of the period.
Yeah. Okay.